This is Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis, welcoming you to this, my Willamette Valley Winemaker Special. Across these 20 episodes recorded in quickfire fashion in January 2020, I got to meet a broad selection of people making wine in the region, both a variety of winemaking scale from the micro to the macro, and also different focuses that include different aging vessels, different grape varieties, sparkling wines, and of course different interpretations of Pinot. Episodes are going to be released in the order that they were recorded, so you'll get to be a virtual guest on the tour. 2 things you can do to help spread this series even further. One is to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, either where you're listening or on your favorite podcast platform. And the second, the one that's really going to help push this out there, is to head to interpretingwine.com/iTunes and leave a review letting me know what you think. A genuine, huge thank you in advance. Today's episode of the Willamette Valley Winemaker Special features father and daughter winemaking team Harry and Wynn Peterson-Nedry. In a fascinating episode that covers from the very start of wine growing in the region and the designation of AVAs, we hear their origin story and establishment of 2 distinct brands, Ridgecrest and RR Wines. We take a deep dive into Ribbon Ridge, its terroir and microclimates, before a tasting of 6 wines presented in 2 mini flights of 3. First a Riesling, Grüner, Veltliner and Gamay Noir, followed by 3 RR Pinot Noirs that span 11 years on the ridge, before they look ahead for the winery. Enjoy!
It's been a fairly long journey. We just completed at Ridgecrest Vineyards our 35th harvest in 2019, in October. And so we've been around for a while. We began our initial vineyard in 1980, and we did call it Ridgecrest, and we have harvested grapes for our own brands since then. Ridgecrest as a vineyard is what we want to talk about. At the same time, it represents greater than just that vineyard too, because it was the first vineyard planted on a specific hill set that has since then been designated Ribbon Ridge American Viticultural Area. That AVA is significantly different from those AVAs around it, even those that may be contiguous to it. So there are unique things happening there, and we can talk at length about soils. We can talk about how it is impinged upon by the AVAs that are around it, whether it's the Chehalem Mountains or Yamhill Carlton or a little bit across the Chehalem Valley, Dundee Hills. So there are a pocket of viticultural areas that we were all very interested in protecting the worth of the fruit that comes off of there and their uniqueness. You talked earlier today with Alex Sokolblasser. Alex, after 2 or 3 times of us sitting down over several years, Dave Adelsheim, myself, you name the key people around, we decided several times not to get into trying to designate any sub-area of the Willamette Valley, which is a very large viticultural area, designate a sub-region, even though we all knew where the choice spots were. We thought it would be divisive, and it took Alex to come up and send to all of us again, hey, may I help in facilitating doing this again and have the discussion and see if this is the right time for AVAs in the Willamette Valley. So we began at Sokolblasser, sitting down with about 15 to 20 people who we all thought would be good to talk about the northern part of the Willamette Valley and what were the specific growing regions that were worthy of special, unique certification. And Ribbon Ridge did end up becoming one of those, and there were 2 or 3 people, Doug Tennell and I, and one other person who took the lead on it and focused on designating that AVA. Everybody participated from all of the viticultural areas, all the growing regions that became viticultural areas. We all participated. Anybody who grew grapes there came to meetings, and we hashed it all out to make certain that it was going to be meaningful. And what we want to talk a little bit about today is the viticultural areas, and then also about what we specifically have in our own wines. We do have 2 brands that my daughter Wynn and I are talking about today. Ridgecrest, in its own right, is a brand now. It's the more current brand that we've created. Prior to that, there was a brand that I created in 2002 that we have that is called RR, which is short for Ribbon Ridge. Ribbon Ridge Winery is a name that we sometimes give that, but we have in the past downplayed that so that we weren't taking away anything from the greater viticultural area. We want everybody on Ribbon Ridge to use that name.
I obviously don't have quite as much of the historical perspective because when I began learning about the winery, I was very young, so it had already been established as a vineyard up on Ribbon Ridge. We started Chehalem when I was 10 years old, so I remember that kind of coming to fruition, sitting down as a family and coming up with names and labels and whatnot. But my official start into the wine industry was after, as any winemaker child can let you know, they want to experience something other than the wine industry for a while as soon as they get out of the house, because being surrounded by dinner parties and wine tastings for their entire upbringing can get kind of monotonous when you aren't a part of it. So I went to the East Coast of the U.S. and got my chemistry degree. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a bit of time, and then I came back to Oregon, which is where my desire to live had always been, after having experienced something different, and worked in another lab at Oregon Health Science University for a couple of years. But I ended up during that time in my mid-20s spending a lot of time out at the winery during harvests and active periods of the year anyway, so decided that the inevitable was pretty obvious, that I was truly interested in the wine industry and wanting to get fully immersed into it. Decided to get my master's degree and bring something of my own to the table as far as wine knowledge and experience and some different harvests around the world. So got my master's from UC Davis in California for 2 years, did a harvest in California, did a couple harvests in New Zealand, did a 6-month internship in France. So kind of traveled around and got my feet wet that way, and then was able to bring some of my own knowledge and experience back to Oregon when I came home in 2009. So as of now, I've been home for just over 10 years, 10 and a half, almost 11 years this year, and kind of worked my way up in Chehalem. And then when we left 2 years ago, have been making wine for the family ever since, and really focusing back into Ribbon Ridge, which has always been the piece of land that I grew up with. We would camp there as a family. I remember being there as a small child.
6 months old?
Well, I don't remember that part of it. Yeah, for many, many summers and harvests and whatnot. So really focusing back on that piece of land again and getting as in-depth there as I can. So yeah, that's kind of my journey, and continue to elaborate on preserving that land and making it a special as I can being expressed through the bottle.
Just kind of, reflecting back on the interviews and I've already done and what I've heard, the Ribbon Ridge, I think has been mentioned a number of times. I guess, we've gone in at various depths, and potentially people have spoken about it, from sort of a helicopter view and helicopter level. But it feels like, between the two of you, we'll be able to, I guess, take the helicopter view, but then also, land the helicopter, dig into the ground and really kind of, have a really strong sense of what's under that soil. And I think, this will be a fascinating exploration for anybody that, really wants to understand Ribbon Ridge, in a sort of more, meaningful way. So I just sort of, throw the door open for you to take us there, take us into that land.
The aerial metaphor is a good one because you do see different things from on high as you're looking down, and you raise certain questions. Why were the first sub-AVAs of the Willamette Valley, why were they created, and why did they come about when they did? If you take a look at, we'll use Ribbon Ridge since we're intimately involved in that, even though we've made wines from 3 or 4 different AVAs over time. Ribbon Ridge is unique, but it's adjacent to 3 other viticultural areas, and it is not far from all of the 6 viticultural areas that were created in the early 2000s. These AVAs, we decided, needed to be out there so people had names to differentiate wines from one growing region to another, because we early on began seeing the differences in the terroir that was there. And some of it, some people pound the table about it's all about soil, others about the environment, the micro and mesoclimate that's in a specific area and how it's influenced by other land masses around. It helps to pull back on the helicopter and realize that we're talking about the Willamette Valley. And the Willamette Valley is a bona fide cool climate growing region. And as such, it falls in with Germany and cool parts of France, Burgundy. It is definitely a cool climate. It is something that is different from what you find 100 miles away in the same state. We have in this climate certain regions that grow different characters of wine. And we're talking here the differences between white wines and red wines. We're talking about Pinot Noir being the ascendant grape variety, and it has been since the beginning here in the Willamette Valley. But the Pinot Noirs that grow on Ribbon Ridge are different from the Pinot Noirs that are grown in Yamhill Carlton, in the Chehalem Mountains, in the Dundee Hills, in the McMinnville AVA, in the Amity Eola Hills AVA. They are worth pursuing for their differences, these different Pinot Noirs. And so being accurate about what we're calling them was necessary. The origin of grapes make a lot of difference. They dictate the uniqueness of the wine that you have in the bottle. As we go down, you realize that the growing region itself and the type of climate we have there is the most important thing driving the wines from our area. After that, it is the specific viticultural area, those soils that might be associated with it. It ends up, of course, depending a lot on what vintage we're talking about. Vintages, especially in a cool climate right on the cusp, vintage makes a lot of difference. It makes the difference between having a red charactered Pinot Noir versus a black versus oh my gosh, this is Cassis. So those differences come many times based on vintage. Now you throw in the confounding element of climate change, and now you have now shifted things. Are these viticultural areas no longer valid? No, they're just as valid. It's just that the character of the wines have shifted slightly in the new climatic conditions. We can go down farther, and maybe Wynn should do this and talk about the differences between the soils that we see in general here in the northern Willamette Valley, and specifically those sedimentary soils that we have in Ribbon Ridge that make a lot of difference. And they show their differences from even the sedimentary soils of a different age that are adjacent to us in the Yamhill-Carlton area. That plus other things make the grapes that Wynn now is assigned the tough job of making on an annual basis.
All right, so you pretty much gave a really good overview of the whole northern Willamette Valley, but when we dive into Ribbon Ridge and Ridgecrest Vineyard in particular, which is seated right at the top of the AVA, so it's at the highest point in the AVA, going down about 150 feet from there, so 675 feet at the top, all the way down to, we probably have it to about 450 feet or so. The soils of the northern Willamette Valley are primarily composed, as Harry was mentioning, of sedimentary, volcanic, and then like a wind-blown silt, a loess soil. You can find those all over the Willamette Valley, but Ribbon Ridge is pretty unique in that it's almost entirely one soil type. It's not mixed as a lot of different AVAs are. You can find little pockets of, loess in with some of the volcanic soils in certain places of other viticultural areas. But for the most part, Ribbon Ridge is entirely sedimentary soil, so old ocean floors. So they've got little fossilized, calcified pieces and lots of minerals. As far as the fruit characteristics that come from those kinds of soils, I tend to see most Ribbon Ridge wines that I've had, the red wines in particular, the Pinots and Gamays and whatever else people have planted up there, as being on the richer, darker fruit side, but also on the bright acidic side. So those marine soils, I think, oftentimes, especially if you have older vines and their roots penetrate far into the minimal water table that is up there, those fruit characteristics can still be bright even though they're rich. So the characteristics from a typical year of Pinot Noir that I get are black cherry, plum skin, blackberry, but always with a bright, fresh finish, bright acidity, and that acid and tannin combination end up making some of the most ageable wines out there. Any wine producer, any wine collector would let you know that acid and tannin and a good balance will help the aging of most wines. So with that combination of almost any fruit up on Ribbon Ridge, we usually get really ageable wines, really tight, bright, focused wines, but also kind of an earthy, spicy note on the finish as well. So as far as white wines go, it's a very good piece of land for white growing as well. We are probably equally as fond of white wines as we are of red wines. A lot of our favorite wines come from Germany and Austria and France, in those cooler regions, just like where we're planted. So Rieslings, Chardonnays. I'm a big fan of Chenin Blanc. We're planting a little bit of that this year. But I think the Ribbon Ridge soils, if people are willing to give them up from Pinot Noir plantings, planting white wines do equally as well up there. So that same structural influence, that same richness, but that same bright acidity that does well for Pinot Noir also does really well for white wines like Riesling, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, etc. So the microclimate that exists on Ribbon Ridge, if you see an aerial topographic map of the region, you'll see that the surrounding Chehalem Mountains kind of envelop Ribbon Ridge a little bit. It's kind of like a flattened horseshoe, and at one end of that horseshoe is the Ribbon Ridge AVA, and it kind of pokes up a little bit more in elevation than the immediately surrounding land masses. So it's kind of a little bread loaf sticking up into the air by itself. At the same time, it also has the highest peak in the northern Willamette Valley, right next to it. So Bald Peak, which is part of the Chehalem Mountains AVA, is right next to it, so protects it from some of the more extreme weather. And then to the west, it has the Coast Range that you can see from the top of our vineyard, and that protects us from any coastal influences. The Willamette Valley as a whole obviously is protected from the east also by the Cascades, but it's kind of its own little pillar out there in the middle of a bunch of other land masses. So it gets great cooling breezes at night in the summertime, so it keeps the diurnal temperature differential quite large in the summertime, so it can be warm there during the daytime, but get quite cool at night, and that's one of the reasons the acid retention is so great on Ribbon Ridge.
This is great to have, the people that know that land and know that part of the Willamette Valley so intimately, and I think, again, what's really interesting to me now is that, you've got a balance here on the sort of tasting list of a balance of white wines, a balance of red wines, and some different varietals, and beyond Pinot Noir, we've got some other interesting varieties I'll let you introduce, and I guess now we're talking and we're going to hear about how that terroir, how that unique site that we've been talking about, how that then shows up in the glass.
Sure. As far as I can remember back, one of the primary wines at our dinner tables and when we went out to eat was always Riesling. So we've always, as a family, been major advocates of bright, ageable wines, whether they're red or white. So Riesling has always been a staple of our table and the fruit that we plant up on Ribbon Ridge. And so it only makes sense that the first white wine that we made under the Ribbon Ridge brand, whether it was Ridgecrest or RR wines, was a Riesling. So we made the Pinot starting back in 2002, but the Riesling we started making in 2014, primarily coming from a mother block of Riesling that we have planted side by side. So we have 6 different clones of Riesling up there. We're major geeks about it. We've got about 0.6 of an acre, so a quarter of a hectare each of 6 different Riesling clones planted in exactly the same orientation on the same exact soil. So we were able to, for a long time, keep them apart, see what characteristics each clone had, and then I've kind of honed in on my favorite couple, and we select directly from those to make a very small quantity of RR Riesling each year. In addition to Riesling, the high acid, wonderful, food-friendly white wines that we enjoy includes the Grüner Veltliner as well. And we have, right next to our mother block of Riesling, we have about 2 acres of Grüner planted, which we make a blended wine from. It's blended in that half of it goes into neutral oak barrels typically, and half of it goes into stainless steel. We got smaller than normal crop load in 2018 because we're still selling a portion of that fruit. So I put it all into neutral oak barrels. So this Grüner, the second wine that we have, will be entirely neutral oak fermented. So it has a little bit more of a richness to it than the Riesling, but really beautifully balanced. And then the third wine that we have in our glasses right now is our Gamay. So we've had Gamay Noir planted on Ribbon Ridge since 1985. As at this point, I don't know of older Gamay in the valley. So right now, as far as I am aware, it's the oldest Gamay in the Willamette Valley. Still own-rooted, and we've got about 2 acres of that. So just like I said, the characteristics of Ribbon Ridge in general, this Gamay has nice bright acid, really good structure, and definitely age-worthy. We've opened some of the Gamays that my dad made back in the early 90s recently, and they're still bright and fresh as ever. So really fun to see the longevity of these wines. The acid obviously is amazing for food pairings as well. So one of the key things for me is, will it go well with food? Will it get overpowered by food, or will it totally overshadow whatever you're eating? And the answer for all three of these wines is no. It will always find lots of meals that it's friendly with.
Thinking back, I don't know that I've necessarily had the opportunity to kind of speak to two generations that have got that close association with the wines and with the terroir. So I'd really just now, I guess, with these same three wines in the glass, just ask you, Harry, to I guess kind of reflect on the evolution, given that we're drinking fairly recent vintages. Your reflections on how these wines may or may not have changed in light of any of those influences that you mentioned earlier.
That's a good question to pose. I think the climate that we're seeing now forces us to think back to the old days and ask the question, has there been a change? And it is pretty apparent, I think, whether you're talking Riesling, where we used to have some Riesling that would take the enamel off your teeth because of high acidity, very low pH. It would be almost every year that you wanted it to get just a little bit riper, a little bit fuller. Now that it's in a sweet spot, we definitely get it ripe. We are picking it earlier than we used to pick it. It was always the last thing that came in, the first, second, or even third week of November. Now Riesling comes in October and sometimes mid-October. So Riesling definitely reflects a ripeness that is there every year, and yet a ripeness that goes along with still good acidity. So we're pleased with that coming from the Willamette Valley, and specifically from Ribbon Ridge and from that elevation. Grüner Veltliner specifically is something that one or two people in the valley, one or two others besides us, decided needed to come in and be investigated. Mainly because it does require more heat to ripen than we traditionally have gotten here. And so as a variety, it offers an adaptation that is going to be necessary with climate change. We need other varieties to depend on. And we've found that Grüner has kind of taken the place of Riesling as being the last white wine and sometimes the last wine period that gets harvested. We bring in the fruit there many times when we have frozen ice on the top of bins of fruit after we've picked them. So gets pretty doggone cold, so it's early morning, and it has definitely gotten richness. You need time, hang time for it to get there. And as things progress climate-wise, it's probably going to get better and better and better. So Grüner Veltliner is a sign of climate change. It's a sign of the direction that we're taking ourselves to guarantee that we've got wines that are perfectly ripe at the time of harvest. Gamay Noir is another grape variety that requires a little bit more heat. Gamay is, of course, the Beaujolais grape variety. Gamay Noir comes in with a little bit more heat than Pinot Noir. It requires more heat, and if you look in Beaujolais, it's a warmer region than, say, the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit in Burgundy. We find this is a good variety for us to look at. We, of course, in our naivete, when we planted Gamay Noir, we said, oh, I don't know where it should go. So we've got this extra plot of land. Let's plop it there. And it happened to be the coolest site on our vineyards, and the worst place possible that if we were to keep it there without climate change, would have planted it. So go figure. Climate change is correcting the bad siting problems that I had.
Yeah, I mean, I've literally just been having a conversation with Bree Stock, around the potential. She was talking more widely, but the areas around the Willamette Valley that maybe do have potential to express different things and through different grapes. Through not necessarily always Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is fantastic, and I'm sure you love what it does, and you've done, I think, collectively, an incredible job of putting it out there as the kind of the poster child of the region, and everyone makes that association. But I think listening to you here and listening to the all the other elements that we're of course very mindful of in terms of climate change, and just the fact that there's a lot of grape varieties out there, and your point, Wynn, to different food pairings, and you don't necessarily always have something on your plate that goes so well with Pinot Noir. You want to try different things. You want the wines to be appreciated in different parts of the world, and where they have different cuisines and they have different palates and different histories of how they kind of use the wines and interact with the wines. And they're all really I just think really powerful examples. I think I'm a kind of an acid freak, I guess you'd say. My ears sort of pricked up when I heard you talking to the bright acidity. And these are just, I just think collectively I want to talk about these wines and just say, they have to be sought out. If you really taking your study or your interest in the Willamette Valley or of Ribbon Ridge seriously, I just think really don't stop at Pinot Noir. Go further, seek out these wines, and as I can see here, they're available, I think, at decent price points as well, and accessible price points. So it's a no-brainer, I would say, to seek out these, and really impressive versions of grapes that a lot of people won't necessarily associate with the Willamette Valley.
We're tasting now RR Pinot Noirs, and we've got 3 glasses in front of us, and we're going to run the 2017, 2013, and 2007 vintages. So a span of basically 11 vintages with one in the middle. We have the opportunity to do this because the RR brand was begun at a time when we were more concerned about interesting people in how Pinot Noir tasted with age. and less about selling everything out in a vintage. So when we release the vintage, it is maybe 40%, maybe 50% is sold from that vintage. Everything else goes back into cellar. And we now, because of that approach and not feeling compelled to sell everything, we have all vintages from 2003 through 2018 here available. What that does is give us the chance to give to restaurants, to consumers, to serious retailers, give them not just one vintage, but give them an array, give them the opportunity to buy in a vertical, and or even cherry pick specific vintages that they like. These three vintages here show a range of ageability. The wines themselves, Pinot Noir is not necessarily thought of in the same in the same way as, say, Cabernet for ultimate ageability. Cab, you have to get them about 20 years old before they are like a brand new Pinot Noir anyway. That was said just to irritate some of my Cabernet growing friends.
So the three vintages we have in front of us represent three somewhat cooler vintages. So again, accenting probably the more delicate side of the Ribbon Ridge fruit in general, but also the acid, brightness, ageability side of it. So 2017 being our current release is probably the warmest of the three. The 13 was a nice warm summer, but also with a very good what they call an atmospheric river that came across the Pacific from a typhoon that died out from Japan. So dropped significant amount of rain, I think 5 or 6 inches in a couple of days during that vintage. But obviously, tasting the wine, it's not diluted. I would call it more refreshed by that rain than anything, because after that rain, we still let that fruit hang out for another 2 weeks or so after the rainstorm went through. We had the luxury of doing that for 2 reasons, one of which is excellent viticultural practices by our vineyard manager, and the other one is because of that little bread loaf that kind of sits atop other pieces of land around it, and that diurnal flux breeze that we get during the summer. It also means that breeze that comes through Ribbon Ridge dries out the fruit much better than it would on a valley floor location. And the vines themselves being as old as they are, the roots penetrate the earth far enough to not be influenced by surface moisture that might be in excess. So because we've been dry farming for the entire life of these vines, they've found their own water source way below the surface, and they aren't root bound to the immediate surface availability, which is great. The 2007 is one of my personal favorites, having been another slightly rainier vintage back in the day, but very good acid. I think this is a classic Oregon Pinot Noir with a little bit of age. So for the RR brand, we do hand select each barrel, so it's definitely not a wide marketplace type of brand. It's a barrel select reserve tier selection, kind of meant to show the epitome of the best fruit, the best balance from Ribbon Ridge viticultural area and from the oldest vines up there. So hopefully that's obvious in its balance. It's obvious in that our current release is 2017 and we haven't yet even bottled the 2018 that's coming up in a month or two. And that we will also hold on to that and release it about a year after we bottle it, because those tannins, that acid, means that wine, that core is really tight when it's first bottled, and even, a year after it was picked and made into wine, so that it needs time to develop and time to open up. And, if we had a decanter, we probably would have decanted this 17 right before drinking, but you can definitely see where it's heading to. It's beautiful in its complexity and tightness.
One of the things that you would notice if you saw the array of bottles here on the table as we're tasting is that not all bottles are equal. Some of these bottles are cork finished, others are screw cap or Stelvin finished. And there has been, after a great deal of research, there's been a change once we were certain that we gathered enough data to prove to me that there was indeed differences. We made a move to screw cap closures, much as the Australians from certain regions and the Kiwis did earlier than we have. Here in the U.S., there is a prejudice for cork or maybe not making a change. We, at least several of us who are technical in nature and like to prove things, have proven that ageability under screw cap is superior to cork. Cork is great when you've got all great corks and you don't have a lot of oxygen ingress into the bottles. Screw caps are great because they do not allow, especially with the type of liners that we have for these screw caps, they do not allow oxygen into the bottle. If you have oxygen go in, then any preservative you've got in the wine ends up attacking any oxygen that's there, so they get used up. And if they get used up, then any further oxidation that happens will be evident in the wine. Plus, sooner or later, the wine will go into its final phases of life, which includes attack by Brettanomyces and Brett-filled wines ends up being the death knell of red wines, especially Pinot Noir. We don't want that death knell, so screw caps have the potential to keep Pinot Noir for decades, 30, 40 years, in very prime, bright condition. So go screw cap.
Part of the advantage of being a pioneer in any region is getting your selection of what you're looking for met. So when we were originally finding vineyard land, and obviously I'm speaking to this secondhand because I was not even speaking at that point. When we were looking for vineyard land, obviously we were looking for the great combination of elevation, the right soil type, the right aspect pointing towards the sun. And we ended up coming across it at the top of Ribbon Ridge, which is at its highest point just above 700 feet, and our vineyard begins at 690 feet. So we're right at the top. You could throw a stone to where the apex of the hill goes over the other side. So with that said, we're exposed to all the elements up there, which includes great wind, as we mentioned, for drying out fruit during rain and also for cooling down during the summer. And it's also not surrounded and impeded by other hillsides nearby, so it gets direct exposure to sun and full advantage of that during the ripening season. And it's got a great view. That's another one of the points up there that I love. So
you can see some points from there.
Yeah, great stargazing.
The kind of riff that I'll take from there is just, I guess one of the things that keep coming up really with the winemakers I've spoken to is this idea of being present being in the vineyard and spending time with your fruit and not kind of winemaking by numbers, or telephoning it in. so sometimes quite literally, and actually, I think having a beautiful site that's actually a pleasure to be in. It can be something that kind of gets you up there. When you may not be going to other sites. I mean, I just think, you've spoken, as I say, as everybody has really on this trip, very eloquently to the source of these wines, and a word always comes to mind when I taste wines side by side like this, and it's vibrancy. I feel really honored to be able to try those 11 vintages and kind of have that kind of time travel, but even the 7, and even speaking to the cork closure, which is the only cork closure of the 3 that we have here, just super vibrant, super young. I mean, these are wines that the 7 still feels young, and so to your point around the 17 being a baby, that's sort of so early in its evolution, and but I think that's the thing, is they are vibrant, they're drinkable now, but it's just the thing is going to be a pleasure for people that follow you, and arguably for you also, to just keep on tracking the evolution in the best possible way, and that's why by sharing and indulging in pairings and sharing them with connoisseurs, because I think that they're wines that, again, the Pinots that I've had have all been quite different, and these feel like 3 of the kind of most serious, I would say, and ones for connoisseurs. Still a pleasure to drink now, but better later, I would say. Just evolving more character, more depth on the nose. I'm just getting more of a sense, I guess, of where these wines are coming from the 7. But very drinkable, and just as well that you're holding those reserves back. Yet again, a huge thank you for your time, your knowledge, your insight, and of course sharing your wines with me. And it's great to again have this oral record and be able to share it and let you share this with the people that may be interested in your wines, and who knows, maybe make some new converts to ones that want to kind of explore and get wines that have been aged in this way. So kind of in classic style, I really just kind of I like to ground us here, January 2020, and just ask you both to kind of look ahead, and you've both, I think, shared lots of really interesting points, and obviously have lots of knowledge around the past of Ribbon Ridge, and shown through your experience and shown through the wines what kind of comes to mind when I ask you to look ahead.
I'll gladly address that. 2020 is a good time to have a good vision. This is the year that marks 40 years since we first discovered this piece of property on Ribbon Ridge, and bought it, and then began planting as soon as we could after that. That said, 40 years is a lot of time to embrace the wine industry, embrace the family that we all joined. It is a collaborative industry here. That's the way it has been. That's the way I would anticipate it continuing to be, because I don't think the next generation will gladly give away the collaboration and some of the underpinnings that made the last 55 years in the Willamette Valley worthwhile and made the industry in general. So I'm going to speak to the future by passing the microphone over to Wynn.
Obviously, the last couple of years, we've been building the RR and Ridgecrest brands up a bit more by focusing on that piece of property and focusing on just the grapes from that vineyard. And looking forward, I think our ideal view would be to eventually be able to spend all of our time up there. So we're making our wine at a co-op winery right now, and it's wonderful to have that collaboration, as Harry talked about, and be surrounded by other winemakers to be involved with and talk to and whatnot. But the optimum thing for us to do is to be able to be next to that land where our fruit comes from. So have a tasting room up there where people can visually see the piece of land that means so much to us and get an understanding for why it's so special and why the fruit there might be pretty unique. And also be able to make the wine a stone's throw from these vines as well. So literally probably just have a tractor drive it to our back door and put it in a tank and ferment it and sell it out of that same door. That's my ideal. I am so dedicated to the land that last summer, with a little bit of free time I had, I decided to construct a yurt and put it up there so I could spend whatever evenings and weekends I wanted there, especially during harvest in the midst of lots of work. So it's kind of a little retreat for us now, but to be able to be up there full time would be kind of our ideal, I think. So, yeah. Build a winery, build a tasting room, be able to welcome people and show them the beauty of that land.
Thank you so much, Harry and Wynn. Absolutely great to sit down with both of you and get that multi-generational viewpoint. And so great to hear the plans that you've got for the site, which I'm sure you'll achieve. I've left below websites for both Ridgecrest Wines and RR. So do be sure to check those out, and if you happen to be in the area, I can highly recommend a visit. If you're based in the UK, these wines are not currently represented, and the pair are actively seeking representation. Next time on the podcast, in episode 395, I'll be sitting down with Adam Campbell, winemaker at Elk Cove Vineyards. That being the 15th episode of this series. To make it easier for you to catch up on any that you might have missed, just head to interpretingwine.com/WVWA to see a playlist that contains all episodes. And if you're not already, I would absolutely love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.